The Day of the Rope by Devon. Chapter 5. Ethan had been watching for several hours for any news of Adam Ehrenberg's death when the iconic blue and red flashing siren gif appeared on his screen. It was followed by the headline, "Free Speech Speaker Killed in Attack." Fuck. Ethan wasn't surprised, but to see it there on his screen like this was surreal. Just for the shortest of moments he wondered if Ehrenberg's body had been found and if this would be seen as a justified retaliation. That would be unfortunate timing. He skimmed through a few of the articles, and there was no mention of a revenge motive from what he could find. According to one article, David Werner and Thomas Wayne, who had become mildly famous internet personalities in the past year or so, and were known for their red meat right-wing videos, were attacked and run off the road on the way to the free speech rally. Werner had been shot and killed, but Wayne Thomas had survived the attack and was expected to live. A photo of their now demolished truck was all over the internet with hashtags like Civil War Now and Justice for Werner. Holy shit, Ethan whispered. Over the last few years, Ethan had witnessed the rhetoric in the comment sections of news articles, until most media outlets removed their comment sections. And on social media posts undergo a slow but steady shift. A shift from frustrated Americans watching their freedoms under attack to people openly calling for a second revolution. The violence in the streets had also escalated. Every time there was a casualty at a rally or a protest, gasoline was thrown onto the fire. Earlier in the year, the left-wing terror group, Anifas, had given a college student who was wearing an "It's Okay to Be White" t-shirt permanent brain damage when they beat him unconscious with a tire iron. The right had responded by doxing the assailants, and they were subsequently arrested. But there was beginning to be talk on the right of taking matters into their own hands. The law enforcement profession seemed to be just as overrun with leftists as any other government job, and all too often, the officers would let Anifas blatantly assault people on the right. The right's patience was wearing thin. If the attack on the now brain-damaged college student, whose name had already been forgotten by the internet, had been gasoline on the fire, then the murder of David Werner and the attack on Wayne Thomas would be an inferno of napalm. Werner and Thomas had relatively small followings, but they hadn't burned any bridges and were likable enough. They had a modest web video channel and ended up being doxxed after making a few anti-SJW videos. They didn't quit the internet like most people that got doxxed. Ethan remembered that he'd been impressed by Wayne's ability to always come across as taking the high road no matter what he did. Some of the more ardent members of the movement called them cucks for never going after Zionists and staying within the lines of acceptable mainstream right-wing talking points. But this was still going to fire a lot of people up. The right had been itching for the left to take the first shot. This made it appear as if it had finally happened. What was really shocking was the number of celebrities on social media that were condoning the attack. The hashtag #ShootNazis was trending, and nobody seemed to be disavowing the murder. Perhaps the left had also been waiting for someone to fire the first shot. This was working out splendidly. Ethan wondered if this would make working the list more difficult, or worse yet, make it unworkable, as normies might decide that they too wanted to taste blood. Then again, maybe he was getting ahead of himself. Ethan still wasn't sure if the list even worked properly. He wouldn't know for certain until he got paid. Or didn't. Initially, He had planned to launder the money through crypto mining services and decentralized exchanges, but then sit on the money for a while. He would cash out only what he needed to fund his operations and fly under the radar. After reading what people were saying online, he wondered if this thing with David Werner might actually spark something bigger than he had first thought. He might have to rethink some aspects of the plan. He might also have to stock up on supplies, and maybe even convert a portion of his crypto into gold in case the blockchain might become an issue. Shit is gonna get crazy, he groaned, but it was impossible for him to stop a gleeful smile from creeping across his face. He wanted to think he was different, but just like everyone else, he too had been waiting for someone to take the first shot. Wayne would provide that spark. He knew Ehrenberg wasn't well enough to be the first casualty that would spark a bigger war. The media still hadn't reported on his death, and he was beginning to think that they never would. He might have to wait for the public records or vital statistics to be updated if it ever made it to the press. The media would be forced to cover this story. There did exist the risk that the media would just make it disappear like they had so many other times in the past when a leftist with a gun went on a rampage. They had begun to realize the threat posed by the internet and would have a hard time ignoring this. It would be interesting to see how the propaganda media would frame it. The amount of coverage would depend a lot on how much time passed before Wayne could get in front of the camera. If he was too banged up to shape the narrative, the traders in the media would write a version of the events that fit their narrative and then sweep the whole thing under the carpet. Ethan would know more in the morning. It was getting late, and he'd been awake now for over 48 hours. Awake and waiting for the news that would execute his smart contract, waiting for the smart contract to pay him out. He scanned the news one more time for a mention of Ehrenberg. It seemed the hit had not been dramatic enough for the press to report it, even with their policy of, if it bleeds, it leads. There were several bleeding bodies to choose from, including those belonging to people that the public had heard of. The people Ehrenberg worked for might be suppressing the story until they knew what was going on. Ethan shut the lid to his laptop and curled up on the couch in his small studio apartment. He was exhausted, but he didn't want to sleep. His mind had been racing with new ideas and inspiration. Insomnia wasn't anything new to Ethan, but this was something different. He imagined what it would be like to rewrite the Constitution. This time, the language would be more explicit and rely less on the assumption that people were basically good, or that people had a natural inclination towards freedom. Freedom was not man's default position. That was a trait unique to the founders. And the people who had risked life and limb by fleeing their homes and crossing the deadly ocean, all for a slim chance that they might be free. There was a very specific set of genes that had gambled it all and survived in the New World. Natural selection had been working overtime for generations by the time the Declaration had been signed. Now the demographics and technology had changed so dramatically that things might have to be revised. Handing freedom to just anyone who showed up at America's shores had resulted in an erosion of freedom for everyone. These new arrivals, who hadn't evolved in circumstances that produced freedom, often wished to do what all men do. They sought to adapt their new environment to fit them, rather than adapt themselves to fit the new environment. This unique trait is one of more significant differences between humans and most other mammals. It's a trait that separates men from beasts, and because this behavior is so unique, it is often overlooked or misunderstood. This first became apparent when the neoconservatives decided to be the alpha capitalists by opening up new markets in countries that didn't belong to them. They merely needed to topple the governments of these primitive countries, hand them a constitution, and then democracy would just magically blossom and grow because all men are created equal. Was misinterpreted to mean all men are created the same, with the same abilities and the same desires. The neoconservatives needed this to be true because, in coordination with the globalist left, they had conceived the CEO class in America would help to promote open borders. They had assured them that it would supply their business with cheap labor. They had fooled people into thinking that these new arrivals were like empty glasses. America could just pour freedom right into them. Immigrants were simply blank hard drives, and all they had to do was install America 2.0, and everything would be fine. They did this without ever stopping to see if the hardwire was compatible. Ethan knew that some of these gullible, out-of-touch boomers were just the middlemen. They were being manipulated and managed like everyone else. Some of them genuinely believed their own bullshit. But even the most deluded politicians on the lower rungs of the ruling class were now faced with the horrifying reality of what they had conspired to create. And they were desperately trying to save face by doubling down on all their worst ideas. This is why there must be changes to the governing documents of the new policy that would emerge from the ashes of this one. Ethan wasn't a policy wonk, and he didn't know how you went about fixing the problem. But he knew something was too broken to be repaired. He knew that sometimes you just had to bulldoze everything to the ground and start fresh. He thought of himself as part of a wrecking crew, not one of the architects that would design the new building. Ethan's mind went over every little detail of what he had done in the last 48 hours. Every step he had taken to make himself untraceable, or rather, to leave a false trail. The surveillance state was always tracking and logging every sliver of metadata generated by people throughout the day, and he had to make sure that data was still created and logged. He had avoided the anomaly of missing data that might have given him away. He had been careful, meticulous. He had started a process of planting the proverbial explosives that would be used to implode the condemned building. Condemned. Was there really any better a word to describe this nation? A hulking, decaying shell of the glorious structure his ancestors had built. It would be bittersweet when it all came crashing down, but nothing lasts forever. Ethan was reminded of the Billy Joel song, Only the Good Die Young. America was a young country compared to other nations in the civilized world. He wasn't sure if it was true or not, but he had heard it said that 200 years was the average lifespan of any democracy. 1976 had been America's 200th birthday. The party was over before he was even born. Out of curiosity, he looked up the lyrics of the Billy Joel song he was now humming to himself. He never knew the words, just the chorus. After a few taps of his keyboard and clicks of his mouse, the lyrics popped up on his screen, and he read them quietly to himself. Ethan smiled grimly. In a strange way, this song had said it all. It had been the rejection of tradition and the embrace of hedonism that had led to the death of society. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Ethan didn't consider himself religious, but even he recognized this. That's the edge that Muslims and Jews had over the West. The West had rejected tradition and had run blindly into the arms of decadence in search of pleasure. In doing this, they had left a God-shaped hole in their souls that they would spend their life trying to fill with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Anything to feel the comfort that religion had provided in the past. Humans were unique animals in that they were probably only beings on the planet so aware of their mortality. This awareness had inspired great things, but it also wasn't without drawbacks. The knowledge that life was a temporary state gave birth to fear, the fear of missing out. It was this fear that had led many in the West to begin viewing religion as an obstacle to new experiences and pleasures. They had been so obsessed with the aspects of religion that put limits on their individual doses of gratification that they never stopped to consider how it might have been contributing to their happiness. It may have seemed counterintuitive to those who viewed God as a superstition, but religion had been a delivery system for wisdom, the same wisdom that died in concert with church attendance and tradition. For eons, humans had packaged sophisticated ethical concepts into easily digestible proverbs and parables that even the most primitive could understand, and that had helped many cope with their mortality. Without the understanding that had guided the lives of their ancestors, the people had become lost and afraid once again. They had devolved back into the primal cave dwellers that trembled at the sound of thunder. When the people had stopped believing in religion, they didn't start believing in nothing. Instead, they would believe in anything. Anything that made the pain go away. Ethan had to consider the possibility that this was what he was doing. Was he really fighting for a cause bigger than himself? Or was he just lashing out because it felt good? That's when Ethan decided to do something he hadn't done in many years. He awkwardly got on his knees and at the foot of his bed bowed his head. Why did this feel so uncomfortable, so foreign? He shifted his weight and tried to block out all the sounds that, until this moment, he hadn't noticed at all. The humming of the refrigerator coming from his small kitchen seemed like it was coming from inside his head. He closed his eyes and tried to remove himself from all the distractions of his surroundings and imagine that he was floating in the darkness. Heavenly Father. End of chapter 5.